In this series, I want to look at where and how every moment of every Marvel project was filmed, and deep dive into the behind-the-scenes trivia of this wild franchise. There's a lot to get to, so with that, full spoiler alert is in effect, and let's get started. A fun fact to start things off. In the Fox logo at the film's start, the X stays on screen for a few frames longer than usual because, X-Men. After a quick CGI particles intro taking us through the workings of mutant DNA, which ends on the X door we will later see leads to Cerebro, the film begins in proper. Movies will often substitute in different cities from where they're actually set, and we see this from the get-go in X-Men. With some grim color grading and a location card, we begin in Poland, 1944. Though supposedly set in Auschwitz, arguably the most infamous Nazi concentration camp, this scene was actually filmed along the historic Distillery District in Toronto. Many of the buildings off to either side are part of the old Gooderham and Worts distillery, at one time one of Canada's largest distilleries. By the late 1800s, it was producing around half of Canada's spirits, but the temperance movement slowed business and it shuttered its doors by the early 1900s. Gooderham and Worts also later came into some public shame after being convicted of tax evasion and paying out $500,000 in fines. The building complex was preserved, though, as a National Historic Site, which worked out great for filmmakers because the stern brick warehouses have made for a perfect bleak spot on camera. For example, also playing the prison in the musical Chicago. Although now refurbished into the artsy Distillery District, the buildings were disused at the time, which lent the dreary vibe for this scene. There also really were around 300 extras traipsing through the mud over 2 long days of filming, one woman even going into shock from the pressure of the shoot. Despite all this attention to detail, you can spot one continuity error in this scene, with Eric's father's star switching sides of his jacket throughout. It's tough to get an exact match on Google Street View as the area used on screen is now occupied by the patio of a Mexican restaurant, but Paige and I only live 12 hours away, so we decided why not go take a look ourselves. From the patio, you can see the looming chimney tower in the background that matches what's on screen. And you can also get a very tasty dinner. After Eric, later Magneto, uses his magnetic powers to bend the gates before being knocked out by the guards, we next flash forward to Meridian, Mississippi for a brief scene. Here we are introduced to Rogue when she accidentally renders her boyfriend comatose through use of her powers. The boyfriend in the film is named David, which is a change from the comic character's name Cody Robbins, supposedly as a shout out to screenwriter David Hayter, who we'll talk more about later on. This exterior has been driving me crazy. I can't find any intel on where this house might be. My guess is somewhere in the Toronto area, as essentially the entire film was shot there, but there's so little to go on, and it could just as easily be B-roll from anywhere. Beyond 2 establishing shots of colonial-style homes along a rural street, one further up the block with the home address 407 visible, and then the primary front entrance shot with the address 401, there's very little to go on. It's also hard to tell from the limited context in this scene whether the interiors were in the same building or filmed entirely elsewhere. If anyone has more information on this scene, drop a comment as I would love to know. There are a few photographs on Rogue's wall which highlight some of the film's later events. We see New York City with a cutout of the Statue of Liberty, nodding to the film's climax, and a slight glimpse of a Washington, D.C. postcard too, nodding to the upcoming political hearing on mutants held in D.C. There's also a picture of Niagara Falls, which isn't far from Toronto, and a postcard of Toronto itself, where we'll see much of the movie was filmed, and may also nod to Rogue later running away to the province of Alberta. After this scene, we supposedly move to Washington, D.C. with a brief stock shot of the U.S. Capitol building. Moving inside follows a scene where the introduction of a Mutant Registration Act is being discussed on the Senate floor. The interiors here are, once again, in Toronto, in the Metro Hall Council chambers. A circular meeting room in the 27-story Metro Hall office building, and one that looks significantly different from the real Senate floor. The building is really used by Canadian city government though, but here it's set dressed with a pretty on-the-nose Capitol building backdrop to remind us that we're in DC. Although we only see this area as an interior for X-Men, the outside of the Metro Hall might look familiar from the opening trap in Saw 3D. During the hearing discussing the dangers of mutant kind, we first meet Senator Kelly. Kelly reads through a list of known mutants, including
a girl in Illinois who can walk through walls,
referring to Kitty Pryde. This character actually appears as a student in the academy, but only as a background character portrayed by Sumela Kay. Kitty Pryde does later become a much more significant part of the franchise, and the role will be taken on by several different actors. The following scene features a meeting between Charles Xavier and Magneto, played of course by real-life besties Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen, who have been close friends since working together for the Royal Shakespeare Company in the 70s. The dynamic scaffolding background is the interior of Toronto's Roy Thomson Hall. This massive concert hall is a main venue for the Toronto International Film Festival, and the home of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra. It's also where this entire confrontation scene takes place. Well, almost. As detailed on the DVD director's commentary, the weird exception is this close-up of Magneto, shot months later in front of a backdrop. We also get this great shot with the wheelchair in the foreground, of course, highlighting the X. The wheelchair was actually sold at auction after the film wrapped, and later rented back for X2. The concert hall itself has seen many other appearances on screen, including Hannibal and Suits. Its two most iconic appearances are probably as UN headquarters in The Expanse, as well as Vought headquarters in The Boys, although much of the location there is digitally expanded. The next scene does finally make use of a location title in Canada, with Rogue fleeing to Alberta. This scene, though, whilst filmed in Canada, was nowhere near Alberta. Likely it was somewhere in the ballpark of the same Toronto outskirts we've seen so far, although an exact location was impossible to pin down as there's so few identifying details here. To make up for not knowing the location, here's a fun actor cameo. The truck driver that drops her off is the voice of Beast from the animated X-Men series. He can also later be seen sleeping in the bar behind a toy truck. Once we head to the bar's interior and meet Wolverine in a cage fight, we're actually back at the film's opening location again, though this time we're on a set built inside one of the old distillery buildings. This scene was actually a relatively late-stage addition to create a stronger introduction to Wolverine. Because it was so late in filming, it actually gave Hugh Jackman time to work up to peak physique. Although certainly never a slouch, he does appear slightly less toned in later scenes that were done earlier in the production cycle. The reason Jackman hadn't had time to work out to his goal body type earlier in the shoot is because he was such a late-stage casting. Originally, Russell Crowe was the top contender for the part, but he turned down the role, instead recommending his then little-known friend Jackman. This suggestion was ignored, though, and the role of Wolverine was originally given to actor Dougray Scott, who was basically forced to drop the project by Tom Cruise a month and a half into filming. The drama here was Scott was starring in Mission Impossible 2, which went over schedule. Despite trying to juggle both films, on Cruise's insistence, he backed out of X-Men to finish Mission Impossible. Despite being very gracious about Jackman's portrayal of Wolverine, this poor guy drew the short straw multiple times in his career. He was a very late-stage contender to replace Pierce Brosnan as Bond, but was narrowly passed over at the last minute by Daniel Craig. Whilst continuing to work, sadly, his career would never reach the heights of Jackman or Craig because of these narrow misses. Someone surprising that did make it into the movie, though, the background actor who says, "Come on, let's do it, let's not do this," is actually the boom mic operator. The introductory Wolverine fight also includes some subtle nods to his adamantium skeleton, including metallic clangs with his punches, and even a slight metallic clink in the sound mix when he stretches his neck. No introduction to Wolverine would be complete, though, without showcasing the iconic claws. Whilst sometimes real, varying between metal or plastic, and sometimes fully digital, this shot of the claw rising up is incredibly a practical effect done with a prosthetic. There's also some nice later series continuity as well. The coat Wolverine wears in the bar scene is the one that he gets in X-Men Origins Wolverine. Another fun later series Easter egg, the The bar brawl is referenced in a news headline in She-Hulk. Right from Wolverine's introduction, we see Jackman play the role with a barely contained pent-up rage. Jackman had a unique way of getting into character, taking freezing cold showers. This started by accident, with Jackman one day trying to take an early morning shower without disturbing his then wife, and discovering, to his dismay, there was no hot water. In winter. In Toronto. The situation made him furious, but still cautious not to disturb his sleeping partner. He then realized that this was a perfect way to get into the headspace of the character, and early morning cold showers soon became a routine part of his character preparation. Despite this commitment, one part of Jackman's preparation was initially lacking. He'd thought the character was based off of wolves, and it wasn't until later in the process that he was told a Wolverine is a completely separate animal. He wasn't the most ill-prepared, though. When Patrick Stewart was initially offered the role of Professor X, he had no idea what X-Men was, thinking he was being offered an X-Files project. We're back outside for the next sequence, following Rogue hitchhiking with Wolverine before the snowy fight sequence with Sabretooth. Although replaced for later films, Tyler Mane, who plays Sabretooth here, at least had some job security for this one, as he was the first actor cast in the entire process. No surprise, as his commitment to the role went so far as to showing up to the audition with fake teeth. The fight sequence was filmed in one of North America's largest urban parks, which makes it a bit tough to pin down an exact location. Supposedly it was filmed along Twin Rivers Drive, a relatively short stretch of road through the park. I followed along the path on Street View, and although there were some similar details, I wasn't able to find an exact frame match along the path. Although the season is completely different on Google, and it was almost 25 years ago, which makes it harder to spot consistent landmarks. Regardless, let's say somewhere generally around here. This scene ran into a number of issues, actually. The sort of random problems that come up when filming on location without the control of a studio. For example, the changing cloud cover on the day ended up making half the footage much brighter and sunnier than was desired, making the final edit crutch heavily on the gloomy blue color grading to keep the overcast look. They also ran into a surprising issue for such an apparently remote shoot. A passerby bypassed the street closure and ran over to berate the crew about, quote, Hollywood types. Later in the moment with the tree crash and attack from Sabretooth, were met with an impressive practical effect where all the snow on the ground was added. While some of it was actual snow, it was all imported for these scenes. The entire area was devoid of snow before filming. Of course, it wasn't the only big practical effect on the day. The camper explosion was also real, and they only had one take to get it. With all of this to consider, there was bound to be some small oversights. For example, there's a bit of a continuity error with the camper repairing itself between crash shots. This scene also introduces us to some other X-Men that we'll see throughout the film. My favorite fun fact among them is that James Marsden, who plays Cyclops, was given a lifetime supply of sunglasses by Oakley, who manufactured the pair later used in the film. We next move to a brief insert in Magneto's lair. In trying to find intel on the location, I accidentally stumbled across Magneto's Lair, a delightfully Web 1.0 site where Ian McKellen blogged about his experience on the X-Men films from the late 90s to mid-2000s. This site actually predates the common use of the term blog, making it one of the earliest such sites on the internet. In this scene, we catch a quick glimpse of Toad, played by Ray Park. This was his first real speaking role, but he might still have looked familiar even at the time, as he played Darth Maul a year earlier in Star Wars Episode 1. The character does have 3 lines in that film, but they're all dubbed by another actor. His resume is even referenced during the later fight scene, with the twirling of the metal bar like his double-sided lightsaber, an intentional detail confirmed by the director. Back to his introduction though, there's a neat, commonly overlooked detail here. That's the Statue of Liberty torch he's painting, which we'll see again later as the same part of the statue where Magneto's conversion device is hidden. Someone who almost didn't get to see this detail, or any detail, was the actor who played Sabretooth. Those contacts to darken his eyes were quite dangerous, and after leaving them in too long, the actor went temporarily blind for around a day, although thankfully making a full recovery. Another odd sidebar here is in the set dressing. The popular chrome Newton's Cradle desktop decorator. A fun detail is that they aren't supported on strings, implying Magneto is controlling them with his mind. An even more fun detail is that Newton's Cradle was first designed by a man named Richard Longcrane, who later went on to become a film director and actually directed Ian McKellen's Richard III. McKellen's most famous role almost didn't happen because of scheduling conflicts with X-Men, but through rearranging the schedule, McKellen was able to make it to New Zealand by January 2000 in time for his scenes as Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings. Finally, we move to the X-Mansion. We begin in the sub-basement, where Wolverine has been brought after being rescued. This location was done on a pretty complicated set. You can see the ceiling and walls don't quite connect because of the unique lighting fixtures, so the entire set had to be held up with an intricate metal scaffolding. The set also wasn't preserved and had to be entirely rebuilt for X2. It's a bit hard to pin down exactly which studio was used, but several sources mention Studio City Toronto, a film studio used on other blockbusters like My Big Fat Greek Wedding and Spotlight. After Wolverine takes the elevator up, we are now in the heart of the X-Mansion in one of the series' most iconic locations. These interiors are all filmed in Casa Loma, a gothic mansion that has reappeared in tons of films and shows. Notably, this includes Hannibal, Billy Madison, the original Goosebumps TV show, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, Chicago, Cocktail, Crimson Peak, and Ready or Not, but that's only a small fraction of the total list. The castle is actually such a popular filming location that they even have a Hollywood Film Gallery exhibit. For X2 though, the location was largely duplicated on sets. Professor X's office is in Casa Loma's Oak Room, a gorgeous space that's decorated with wood paneling that took 3 years to carve. This cinematic space also plays Billy Flynn's office in Chicago and nowadays operates as a steakhouse in real life. When Wolverine meets Professor X, there's another very small detail that ties into the challenges of filming once again. Behind Professor X, there is faintly visible foliage outside that disappears and reappears throughout the scene. This happens because the winds outside were so strong that the foliage was blowing around distractingly, so at one point during filming it was removed altogether. As we move to the exterior of the X-Mansion, we are actually at a completely different location, the Parkwood Estate and Gardens. In real life, this beautiful home was originally owned by the founder of General Motors of Canada, while the X-Mansion is supposed to be in Westchester, New York, just north of New York City. Both the interior and exterior filming locations are still in the Toronto area of Canada. As a sidebar, our first view of the mansion's exterior shows a basketball game with a seemingly advanced visual effect of a kid teleporting. Was this achieved with technical wizardry and significant pre-planning? Nope, it was a last-minute shot done with triplets. There's next a quick shot of a kid running across a pond in the school's gardens. Although aesthetically similar, this jumps halfway across the real-world map, as these are actually the gardens of the Greystone Mansion in Beverly Hills, California. You can actually see this exact same pond in the gardens of Wayne Manor in 1997's Batman and Robin. We'll return to this location later and go into more detail then, because the mansion itself is a very popular Hollywood set. We're next back at Casa Loma for a few more interiors. Firstly, the classroom, which is actually the building's conservatory with some set dressing. This room in real life can also be rented out as a wedding venue. We can here see several characters from the X-Men comics playing minor roles, including Jubilee, Shadowcat, and Pyro. Some of these characters later reappear in the series in expanded roles, although they are recast. There's a brief shot of Cyclops with his motorcycle, filmed in the castle's automotive museum. The real museum largely displays cars from the early 1900s, which have been moved aside for contemporary vehicles for this brief moment. We divert briefly with a quick insert of the X-Mansion hangar, which I haven't found much specific intel on, but seems to be a continuation or repurposing of the earlier basement set. The next brief moment following Wolverine and Professor X through stables is back to Casa Loma, just around the corner from the museum, this time featuring the actual stables of the castle. We now jump back to the story of Senator Kelly and see him getting out of his limo and hopping into a helicopter. This was filmed at the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum, an aviation museum located in an Ontario airport. The scene originally started with a cool shot of the limo passing the museum's military aircraft, which director Bryan Singer has expressed some regret over cutting. The actor who plays Senator Kelly, Bruce Davison, previously did director Bryan Singer a favor by taking a role in Singer's earlier film, Apt Pupil, which was repaid by Singer in casting him for this role. I don't want to sidebar too much on this, but I can't mention Bryan Singer without noting the director's extremely problematic behavior. Despite going on to direct and produce a number of other X-Men films, his on-set behavior was erratic, arriving chronically late and often erupting into explosive tantrums. At the time, he blamed this on medication he was taking for back pain, but almost 20 years later, he would be fired as director for similar behavior on Bohemian Rhapsody. His offset behavior is also much, much worse, with multiple heinous allegations stretching back to the late 90s. In researching this video, I also discovered he grew up in the same town as I did, and graduated from the same school district, albeit 30 years earlier than me, which is rough, as our alumni game otherwise is pretty weak. We did have Ethan Hawke though, so I'm gonna cling to that and move on. Back to helicopters. If you look closely, the helicopter he gets into is not the same one that is flying, with details like the US SEAL missing. Once on the helicopter, I'm certain this is a set, although I can't confirm exactly where it was built. Mystique is soon revealed in the scene, which includes some interesting filming backstory. Rebecca Romijn, credited as Rebecca Romijn Stamos in the film as she was married to John Stamos at the time, played Mystique in this film, and she had a lot of issues with the intensive makeup. To apply the prosthetics, which covered 3/4 of her body, it could take up to 8 hours to put on and 2 more to remove, meaning she would sometimes work 24-hour days. To keep the look secret, Romijn would have to spend long stretches of time isolated from the rest of the cast when not filming, which she described as hell. The makeup itself became hell too. It began to remove layers of skin, especially with the chemicals used to scrub the blue paint. These chemicals would also begin to burn if not washed off quickly, meaning she would have to run to the on-set shower, which reportedly didn't even work half the time, making for some miserable on-set days. For this helicopter scene, she begged Bryan Singer to CGI the eyes yellow instead of the contacts she used throughout the rest of the film, because she was worried about accidentally kicking actor Bruce Davison as the contacts obstructed her sight. Even though this special effect wasn't budgeted for, Singer relented, and we can see it all paid off when Romijn accidentally kicks him in the face anyway and knocks his glasses off. The scene finishes with the copter approaching an island. Not a real one though. This was digitally added in post. After briefly returning to some of our underground sets with Wolverine, we next continue the story of the Senator in the open-air part of Magneto's lair. This was actually an outdoors shot where they flooded a park outside of Toronto, seemingly in the Greenwood Conservation Area, slightly north of the city. Ian McKellen refers to the site as Hamilton though, which is just south of Toronto, but I think this may have been an error in attribution as he does mention in the same blog post that the set was built 70 minutes north of Toronto, which tracks with the Greenwood Conservation Area. Regardless, this outdoor scene was genuinely very cold. All the fog coming off the actor's breath was real. One evening, they even had to pause filming because of a massive windstorm. Most of the surrounding elements are practical here. Many of the large rocks were built on set, although some of the background elements are digital. I can't confirm for certain, but as we jump back to the X Mansion, this time in the bedrooms, I believe we are now on purpose-built sets. One fun detail here is how difficult it was to manage the actors' varying heights. In the comics canon, Wolverine is quite short at only 5'3". Hugh Jackman in reality is a literal foot taller than that. Other castmates were remarkably tall as well, including Famke Janssen, who played Jean Grey, clocking in at 6 feet. James Marsden, playing Cyclops, is shorter at 5'10", so to balance the heights of the characters, he almost always would have to wear heeled shoes or walk on raised tracks. Now, 5'10" is a pretty standard height, but compared to the rest of the freakishly tall cast, he needed this boost just to keep things in perspective. Continuing on, we see B-roll flashes to Wolverine's past as Jean Grey reads his mind. It's basically impossible to get intel on where these would have been filmed, but likely it was on a soundstage. Kevin Feige was actually supposed to have a cameo as a general here, but it ended up being cut. This was still early in Feige's career, here working as an associate producer, but of course he would later go on to lead much of the trajectory of the entire MCU. At this humble point in his career though, he was already known for being the on-set comics guru. Comics were actually banned on set as Singer claimed it would lead to two-dimensional character portrayals, but Jackman would sneak over to Feige, who kept a secret stash and would encourage him to read up on Wolverine. He was also the leading voice insisting on Hugh Jackman's comic-accurate hair. Following the incident with Rogue and the Claws, we have a brief scene with Patrick Stewart in the bedroom. Apparently, this scene was shot at 7 a.m., right before Patrick was scheduled to fly out of town, and he was so exhausted for the filming that in one take he accidentally backed his wheelchair fully into the doorframe before bumping off and course correcting. Next up, the senator escaping his cell was all done on a set, and it's amazing how the editing helps sell this scene. Look at how anticlimactic it is behind the scenes with the awkward wind machine noise. Of course, beyond the edges of the frame, this set is digitally extended as well. After his big digital fall, Senator Kelly next washes up on a practical beach. This is Paradise Cove, a stretch of beach in Malibu about an hour west of Los Angeles, California, shot here as all the beaches in Toronto were too cold. This was a pretty last-minute shoot as well, filmed less than 2 months before the film premiered in theaters. As the senator wanders up the beach, we see a TV playing some B-roll of New York City, including the Statue of Liberty. There's also mention of Ellis Island. We'll get to these both later on. This scene also features a few cameos, one of which is, very unfortunately, Brian Peck, as the hot dog stand customer. If you know the name at all, it's probably from Quiet on Set, which details his horrific assault of Drake Bell when Bell was a kid starring on Drake and Josh. Peck, who was convicted and sentenced to 16 months for this, was also good friends with director Bryan Singer, which is no surprise considering their alleged shared interests. The two also co-narrate the DVD commentary, which makes for an unfortunate retrospective watch. If you backtrack a few frames, you see another friend of Singer's, Gary Goddard, who, big shocker, was later accused of multiple similar assaults. In much brighter news, though, is the cameo on the other side of the hot dog cart, where we see Stan Lee as the vendor. Stan Lee, the creator of many Marvel characters, had a long run of cameos throughout the Marvel series. This isn't his first, though. He shows up as far back as 1989's TV movie, The Trial of the Incredible Hulk. There was even a cameo filmed for 1998's Blade, although it was left on the cutting room floor and is seemingly lost media nowadays. Back at the school, we revisit some locations from before, including the Parkwood estate for exteriors. This scene of a disguised Mystique joining Rogue on the bench includes some pretty roughly disguised ADR when dialogue is re-recorded in post-production. Rogue calls out Bobby, as in Bobby Drake aka Iceman, but pretty clearly looks to be saying Sean, the name of the actor playing the role. There have also been debates over whether the visible breath is an intentional nod to Iceman's powers, but it's clarified in the director's commentary that it was just a cold day in Toronto that had started to warm up slightly when Rogue's close-up was filmed later in the day, hence no visible breath for her. Moving inside, Xavier goes into the Cerebro room, and we get an interesting combination here. There were practical elements to this set. The blue wall behind Patrick Stewart is sometimes real. A practical wall was built, but it could be moved around so that for wider shots it could be subbed out for a green screen, allowing them to digitally extend the background. This leads into a neat visual effects shot, where I'm assuming most of these quick passerby were shot in a studio against green screen. This effect fades into the train station, but we'll return to that in a moment to discuss the full scene that takes place there. Professor X, here conversing with the others, posed an interesting challenge. The Cerebro set was 2 stories tall, and so couldn't be attached with the hallway set. So they were actually done on 2 different stages. Every time the shot changes, we are jumping to a completely different set. The next quick garage scene is once again back at Casa Loma's antique car museum, with cars swapped out. From this perspective, we can see the floor though, which I think was covered for this scene. In this photo of the museum, every detail matches except for the wooden floor, so I'm presuming the giant X in the center of the room was intentionally added in, rather than a serendipitous pre-existing detail of the castle. There's a quick scene of Wolverine on Cyclops' motorcycle as well, which could truly have been filmed anywhere. I can't find any intel on it, and there's no real landmarks to go off, but we can safely guess it's somewhere in the woods surrounding Toronto. Moving to Wolverine's meeting with Rogue on the train, we are in an actual train here, although not an actual station. This was filmed at the Toronto Maintenance Centre, a train repair facility. You can kind of tell it's a train yard as opposed to a real station when the train later stops. Even the bleary view out of the windows is actually of fake platforms. They had to be built up so that people would be able to walk by the train convincingly as if it were in a real station. As we jump back to the mansion, we see 2 Icemen in one take. This moment does use motion control to blend 2 separate shots, although after filming they would realize that Iceman actor Shawn Ashmore actually has an identical twin brother, so they could have used their earlier twin technique here too. We cut around to a few locations we've already visited before landing in the train station for our next big set piece. This location makes a great train station because that's exactly what it used to be. Leuna Station spent over 60 years as an operational railway station until closing its doors in 1993. It was renovated and reopened in 2000 as an events center, used largely for weddings and similar events. It still maintains its former grandeur though, which makes it easy to use for a train station set without the inconvenience of disrupting actual commutes. The Grand Hall has been spun into a couple different locales on screen, including a bank in the Umbrella Academy and a hotel in Titans. Inside, we get this lovely moment with the kids smiling up at Cyclops, made all the more lovely by the fact that it wasn't even scripted. This kid was just a real-life X-Men fan who couldn't stop smiling on set, so the moment was added to the scene. Further along in the sequence, we see that waiting in line behind Storm is another one of Bryan Singer's friends at the time, though finally, one who hasn't landed himself in legal trouble. This is Adam Robitel, who at the time was getting into stunt work, which is why he was tasked with getting thrown about on wires for this moment. But he would later go on to switch his focus and direct several horror films, like Insidious: The Last Key, Escape Room, and its sequel. He would also go on to write Paranormal Activity: The Ghost Dimension. He would make it out of this scene unscathed, although Halle Berry was less lucky, and really was accidentally slammed into the window by Tyler Mane, although not in the shot that breaks the glass. That was intentional. A fun practical effect you can spot in the scene. To get Maine's hair to stand up, he was attached to a Van de Graaff generator and run through the same experiment you probably saw at a science museum as a kid. Thankfully, an experiment that didn't lead to injury here. Back to injuries though, the train being torn apart was a real train really torn apart. The fire effect caused insulation to burn, essentially raining down molten insulation and burning a stuntman. To its credit, the film makes really good use of practical effects. As we jump back to the train station sequence, we get this cinematic moment with Magneto lifting and dropping the cars, which was filmed practically by having a crane actually drop cars for the shot. The filming drew a huge crowd of locals, who you can actually see in the background of the scene. As this scene was one of the big ones that moved the production away from Toronto, the actors were given new and slightly less spectacular accommodation in Hamilton. This led to several cast members asking if they could instead just sleep in their trailers. But this is apparently not allowed, as Bryan Singer discovered during another night of filming when he tried to spend the night in his trailer, but while sleeping, the crew collapsed the bed and drove him, still asleep, back to Toronto. Even little moments make good use of practical effects, like simply dropping the lights out behind Patrick Stewart during the moment where he jumps into the senator's mind. The remainder of the sequence flashes through locations we visited before, so let's move onwards to the senator's gross explosion into a big puddle. There's actually a slight goof visible here. As Halle Berry turns to run away, you can see her mic wire on camera. We revisit a few familiar locations before moving to our next big spot to begin the climactic final act. We're waved into this scene by Ben Jensen, the stunt coordinator's son. He's waving here from the shores of Liberty Island, where the Statue of Liberty sits. Except of course he isn't. He's actually waving from the shore of Spencer Smith Park, about 90 minutes southwest of Toronto. It's remarkably good location scouting though. Look how similar these two places look. When we next cut to the boat, we see another usage of the fan-favorite twins trick to get this illusion. As we next move to the Conference of World Leaders, we're supposedly over at Ellis Island. Although a common Mandela effect combines the two, the geography here is correct. Ellis Island, the famous immigration port, is a totally separate island from Liberty Island, which has Lady Liberty herself. Despite accurate geography, we're once again nowhere near New York in real life. This scene was captured at the Central Toronto Academy, which is pretty much exactly where the name suggests. Despite all of the trickery on camera, the film's premiere was actually held on the real Ellis Island, with the Great Hall converted into a movie theater. This scene starts off with a sort of cameo, although we only see the back of their heads. The two playing the King and Queen of Poland are Bryan Singer's father and stepmother. Back at the shore, another cameo is Tom DeSanto, the film's executive producer, who gets squashed by Toad. There's also a couple interspersed aerial shots. It's hard to tell if this was second unit photography of the actual area or a digital recreation, but given the accuracy and detail for the time, I'm going to guess this is probably real aerial shots of New York. We cut once more back to the boat, where in a bit of a goof you can briefly see that next to Mystique is the actual person driving the boat. After a couple more interior sets with the X-Men, we see them prepping to take off in the jet. Naturally, this was done on a set, and there's some fun cost-cutting props you can spot, like the X-Jet's handle simply being a video game joystick, a painted Flight Stick Pro used for flight simulators in the 90s, that you can snag online for $20. Before taking off, there's this line.
You actually go outside in these things? What would you prefer? Yellow spandex?
That directly references the fan backlash to dropping the comic-accurate costumes, here specifically pointing to Wolverine's classic yellow outfit. Almost 25 years later, things came delightfully full circle with this snarky line from X-Men 97.
What'd you expect? Black leather?
We also finally got the yellow outfit's live-action debut in Deadpool and Wolverine. As the jet takes off, we jump to an interior bedroom at the Academy, which I think is on a set but could possibly be a room at Casa Loma. The exteriors are back at the Parkwood estate though. As the jet passes by New York, I think we are again looking at second unit footage. For example, this does really appear to be the George Washington Bridge, as they'd outlined in their plan, but it's a little bit tough to tell how much is real as there's also quite a bit of CGI added in. As the X-Men disembark onto the island, this was the first time the actors wore their suits on camera, and the costumes were so tight that the actors repeatedly could not make it over the shamefully tiny divider. The cast fell over multiple times. Hugh Jackman ripped his pants, and James Marsden was quoted saying, "You couldn't feel less like a superhero in these costumes." As we move into the museum, we are naturally still nowhere near Liberty Island in real life. While there is actually a Statue of Liberty museum on the island now, it didn't open until 19 years after this film was released, and looks nothing like the museum in the film. This scene was filmed at the Bridgman Transformer Station, an important part of Toronto's electrical grid, which conveniently had some nondescript interior space to transform into the museum. The opening shot entering the museum shows a couple security camera displays with wide shots of the gift shop set, as well as security footage of the X-Men sneaking in. There are also so many great little Statue of Liberty details in this museum. Cyclops is kicked into a scale model of the statue's pedestal. We can even see a picture displayed in the case of Richard Morris Hunt, who really did design the statue's pedestal. His other most famous work is the entrance of New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. This seems to be an enlarged picture of a postcard from 1917, at least according to this eBay listing. And this is a copper whirligig from 1986 depicting the artist's grandfather, who jumped ship and swam ashore to America. The fight scenes here are great, and it's no surprise given the fight choreography team. Several people worked on the choreography and stunts, but my favorite name among them is Ki Hui Kwan, who worked as an assistant fight choreographer and translator for those of the stunt team that didn't speak English. Previously known for his roles in The Goonies and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, Kwan of course made an epic comeback on screen in Everything Everywhere All at Once. Footage resurfaced of Kwan choreographing on the set of X-Men, which is somewhat bittersweet as he couldn't get roles at the time because he was being typecast, but still had such an epic influence in his choreographing capacity. Everything came delightfully full circle though, when 20 years later, he would star in the MCU in Loki Season 2. Even with a lot of people on set keeping track of things during the fight, it's tough to catch everything. For example, we have this one continuity error when Cyclops blasts open the door. He starts operating his visor with an ungloved left hand, but the reverse angle shows a gloved right hand. As he then runs to Jean Grey, he's wearing gloves on both hands, but for the following close-up, neither hand is gloved any longer. Eventually the fight moves to the second level, through the gift shop that we saw earlier on the security camera. We also get this great fight between Wolverine and Mystique, with an even greater behind-the-scenes tale. This was filmed on Rebecca Romijn's last day on set, and to celebrate, she brought in tequila. Because of the day of fighting and stunts though, she ended up getting nauseous, and thanks to her extensive makeup, had a big blue-hued barf all over Hugh Jackman. It's also no surprise that a fight scene featuring bladed claws comes with some risks. The stunt woman playing Mystique got stabbed during a take, and left with a small scar. But, of course, the centerpiece of the brawl is when Storm delivers the film's most iconic line.
Do you know what happens to a toad when it's struck by lightning? The same thing that happens to everything else.
This moment wasn't actually written by any of the film's main three writers, but another name who would later see much success with comic book adaptations. Joss Whedon, at the time best known for Buffy the Vampire Slayer, was brought in to punch up the script. Most of his changes were ignored, but this infamous line of his was left in, which makes you wonder what he possibly submitted that didn't make the cut. He'd later go on to direct 2 Avengers films and write as well as finish directing the Justice League that you didn't like after Zack Snyder stepped down. Also, as a surprising sidebar, he wrote the original Toy Story. Back inside we go to finish the fight between Wolverine and Mystique, where Rebecca Romijn had to endure one last indignity. At the fight's end, when she's laying on the ground, note the hand position. This is because by this point in the shoot, the makeup had begun to fall off, and instead of touching up key areas, she was directed to lay like this. And now we've arrived at the climax, here atop the head of the Statue of Liberty. Naturally, this wasn't filmed in the actual head, but rather a recreation done on a set. Its detailing is accurate to the real statue, but the set is actually larger than its real-world equivalent. The set for the crown's top was massive too. It actually required one of the largest ever green screen sets at that time. What made these giant headsets even more troublesome was that they had to be rebuilt for pickup shots. The segment with these 3 talking in the head was filmed later in Los Angeles, as Singer wasn't happy with the original footage, requiring a brand new crown to be constructed. During the drama of this final battle, we cut between the various Statue of Liberty locations that we've discussed. In all the chaos, you might not even notice that Ian McKellen isn't the one getting zapped off the torch here. It's a stunt double, as McKellen was already off in New Zealand filming for Lord of the Rings. What you probably did notice, though, is Rogue finally getting the iconic white hair. In this film, it was an extension, although it was actually dyed for the sequel. If Hugh seems stressed about cutting Rogue down at the scene's end, it's not just his acting ability. The day prior to filming this, he had almost accidentally impaled the camera guy with his claws during a lunge, leaving him understandably nervy around the claws for this sequence. The Statue of Liberty segment closes out with one last fun cameo. The film's screenwriter, David Hayter, appearing as this cop. Hayter would later co-write other superhero films like X2 and Watchmen, but is best known for voicing Solid Snake in the Metal Gear video games, at least until being replaced by Kiefer Sutherland for Metal Gear Solid 5. We next find our characters recovering back on set. There's a quick cut to a mansion exterior, and this one was really tough. There's no information on it that I could find, and there's quite a few buildings that look very similar. I thought maybe it was second unit footage of Coe Hall Historic House Museum, which looks so similar, but there's a few discrepancies between the two. After much searching though, I found it. This establishing shot is actually Rinwood Mansion, a historic home that currently ties in 100th place for largest homes in the US. Its 17 fireplaces, 11-car garage, 2-story library, and 6,000 bottle wine cellar could all have been yours for a cool $23 million back in 2019. It's also located in Old Brooksville, Long Island, which makes it the only shot I can confirm was actually filmed in New York. We get some resolution with our heroes back at Casa Loma, and also catch a moment with Mystique impersonating the senator on TV. This scene filmed back at Roy Thompson Hall from the start of the film. If you continue to listen to the news report playing in the background, you can hear it actually explains what happened to the real Senator Kelly's aide, Guy Ritchie.
In a related story, the body of Senator Robert Kelly's longtime aide, Henry Guy Ritchie, was found today. Preliminary coroner's reports seem to indicate that Guy Ritchie was mauled by a bear.
Presumably, the bear here refers to Sabretooth. As we follow Wolverine outdoors, we hear jump across the continent to Greystone Mansion. We saw this briefly earlier, but now get a much better look at this bit of Hollywood royalty. This might be the most filmed location in this movie. Especially the mansion's interiors are popular in Hollywood. It plays the mayor's residence in Ghostbusters 2, the White House kitchen on the West Wing, the Lebowski mansion in The Big Lebowski. The Children's Hospital in Star Trek Into Darkness houses the bowling alley from There Will Be Blood, plays the Academy in Austin Powers Goldmember, plays Chilton Academy in Gilmore Girls, the Chinese Consulate in Rush Hour, and portrays mansions across Garfield, A Tale of Two Kitties, National Treasure 2, The Bodyguard, and Columbo. Hugh Jackman would even get to visit again as it plays his home in The Prestige. The mansion will also look familiar from other Marvel moments, appearing as Howard Stark's mansion in Agent Carter, and most famously, Norman Osborn's mansion in Spider-Man. And that only covers a small fraction of the content filmed there. Our last shot of the school pans to this sign. There's a couple potential Easter eggs here. Grey Malkin is the name of the witch's cat in Shakespeare's Macbeth, and Salem naturally brings to mind the witch trials, reminiscent of the persecution the mutants face. If you want to study the sign to find out more details to break down, you're out of luck though, as Bryan Singer admits he stole it after filming Wrapped. We close out the film with an epic scene of Magneto and Professor X playing chess, made only slightly less epic with the knowledge that neither actor knew how to play chess, and a chess grandmaster had to be brought in to teach them. One of the moves he taught was a pawn assault, with the idea being that Xavier is so smart he checkmates Magneto using his pawns. If the movie's final lines sound familiar,
Yes. Your continuing search for hope.
possibly you've seen X-Men Apocalypse recently, as the lines are reused almost verbatim for that film.
Yes. Hope.
And that closes us out with one last epic and largely practical set for this final scene. One more fun fact to wrap up that I wasn't sure where else to put. Throughout the film, we've heard a sweeping orchestral score composed by Michael Kamen. Well, to keep everything to theme, here's how his name is spelled on the movie's original soundtrack CD. Alright, well thanks for joining me in breaking down how and where this movie was made. My hope is to eventually do similar breakdowns of everything in the MCU. If you enjoy this type of thing, let me know if there's any other franchises you'd also like to see broken down in a similar way. Beyond that, drop a fun fact I missed down below, and catch y'all next time.